Well, thanks everybody. Welcome to the next presentation in our Working Tools seminar series. My name is Andrew Martindale, and I'm here on behalf of Eric Simons and Alison Wiley as organizers of community-facing data management platforms for Indigenous university partnerships. And I'd like to begin, as we always do, by acknowledging that UBC Vancouver is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. The land it is situated on has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam, who for millennia have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. And as a recipient of some important instruction from Musqueam colleagues, I can attest to that legacy. And as all of our presenters in the series have noted, such acknowledgements need to move beyond aspiration and into the hard work of transforming academic practice. And I'm going to draw your attention to a recent article by Tim Snyder and Catherine Hayes titled Epistemic Colonialism: Is it possible to decolonize archaeology? As a powerful evaluation of these challenges. I'll put that link in the chat. I'd also like to acknowledge the support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and from UBC's Green College for helping us organize this series. I'd like to ask if you wouldn't mind to keep your microphones and video feeds turned off. If you have a question or a comment during the presentation, please add it to the chat or let us know that you'd like to ask something. Eric Simons will compile these for the discussion after the presentation, although I have a feeling that Sara and the others are going to do a little bit of a question and answer at some point, so they'll be inviting you to use your chat and you can follow their lead as they do so. If you've missed any of our previous talks, the recordings for all these presentations are available on our website. It's with great pleasure that I welcome our next presenters. Sara Gonzalez is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Washington and a curator of archaeology at the Burke Museum. Ian Kretzler is a recent PhD graduate from that department, and Briece Edwards is the manager of the Historic Preservation Office at the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. Their co-authored paper from 2018, Imagining Indigenous Archaeological Futures, Building Capacity Within the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, is an exploration of collaborative research practice that builds out of community-based research partnership between the Grand Ronde and the University of Washington, a project that includes a summer field school. More recently, Sara and Briece have published a 2020 article titled The Intersection of Indigenous Thought and Archaeological Practice, the Field Methods in Indigenous Archaeological Field School, that further explores these themes of reciprocal capacity building, Indigenous data sovereignty, and transformative archaeological practice. And their presentation today focuses on similar themes. It's titled Indigenous Heritage Futures, Caring for the Past in a Grand Ronde Way. Their central question, how can an indigenous nation make archaeology work for and in accordance with tribal needs and values, is really central to our series and indeed to the broader conversations that we're hoping to contribute to with our papers and presentations. Please join me in welcoming Sara, Ian, and Briece. Sara.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Andrew. I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the shared lands and waters of the Lushootseed speaking peoples, the Duwamish, the Squamish, Muckleshoot, and Tulalip nations. And I also want to acknowledge the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde for granting me and Ian the privilege of living and working on their homeland and community for the past 5 years. One of the best things about the Indigenous Science Cluster and the Working Tools Seminar has been our ability to think together critical questions and issues that we're facing in the care and protection of Indigenous heritage futures. It's been really wonderful to learn from the deeply transformative work that Indigenous nations here in the US and in Canada have been doing alongside archaeologists to think through this issue of data management in Indigenous-led and partnership-based research, and to develop alternative platforms for collecting, managing, and representing Indigenous data. This type of collaborative and collective thinking across political and theoretical and other borders is itself a tool of resistance. Where in sharing with one another, we begin to unsettle the colonial structures that enable the erasure of Indigenous peoples from the modern world, including from consideration within institutions like the Academy. And we can begin to transcend the physical and imagined boundaries used to undermine Indigenous peoples and nations' larger networks of relation and their sovereignty. So in that spirit of collaboration, we want to open with a brief activity as a way to ground our discussion of what it means for us to indigenize archaeological data. So for the next 2 minutes, we want you to think about the following question here on the PowerPoint. What does Indigenous data sovereignty mean to you? What might it look like in the context in which you work? I'm going to set a timer for 2 minutes. You can grab a piece of paper or you can just type directly into the chat. Just want you to reflect upon this and answer it for yourself. We'll come back in 2 minutes and you can either, like I said, type your answer into the chat or you can unmute and share with us briefly. There's another minute left. So just wrap up kind of your final thought there. And as you feel comfortable, you can type in your answers into the chat. We'll give a few seconds for folks to respond. You can either send it to me privately or Ian Kretzler privately, or you can just send it to everybody. We'll give a few moments for people to start adding in and or sharing. If you would prefer, you can also unmute and share directly if you raise your hand. And we're getting some. So in posing this question, our goal is threefold for us. First, it foregrounds our discussion today within the broader framework of Indigenous sovereignty. Second, it begins to encourage us to think about what we do as archaeologists as one of constructing, recovering, managing, and communicating data. Within this framing, dealing with data isn't something that happens after the archaeology is done and we're back in the lab or at our computers, but it's a fundamental aspect of what we do as archaeologists at all stages of the research process, from problem posing to curation and sharing of knowledge. And finally, from the perspective of three non-Indigenous archaeologists who work with and for a tribal nation to care for its heritage, we argue that the concept calls on us to consider how we can achieve equity and how we care for Indigenous data. So now I want to go back to the chat so that we've had a little bit of time to see what folks have said here. And we've got one from Allison: data sovereignty at a minimum, all data related to Indigenous communities' heritage, readily accessible to them, better that it be held by Indigenous communities with access controlled by them. So we have this issue of access, of control, as well as relation to Indigenous knowledge. Another, Kelsey, says, to me, Indigenous data sovereignty means working with my community partners and ensuring that the ownership and control of all data is maintained by the First Nation. In the context of my work, it means finding new avenues of storing and managing data to ensure this occurs. There's structural capacity within Indigenous and non-Indigenous institutions to overcome colonial double standards and recognize scholarship from its numerous standpoints. This gets at another kind of critical aspect here, that Indigenous data sovereignty isn't just about ownership and control, it's about challenging the colonial structures that have erased and or disenfranchised Indigenous peoples from their data, from, more appropriately, from their own knowledge and their own heritage and histories. Now, I like to use the definition that Rainey et al. Here have put together of seeing Indigenous data sovereignty as the right of Indigenous peoples and tribes to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. Within this framework, Indigenous data is gathered within and outside of the nation. It's rooted in the sovereign rights of Native nations and connects back to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it also calls our attention to the fact that the ability to enact Indigenous data sovereignty is constrained by the degree to which settler colonial relations and structures permit. This is a really important point here, that the structures that we have set up typically, like I said, erase and or disenfranchise Indigenous peoples from ownership as well as control and access to their information, their knowledge. Now, IDS, for short, Indigenous Data Sovereignty, was designed and has been designed to highlight how Indigenous peoples have been typically left out of larger discussions of data sovereignty, which often focus on multinational corporations and issues of legal jurisdiction. But before we get into what data sovereignty looks like in a Grand Ronde context, we want to review 4 major takeaways and questions from this concept of Indigenous data sovereignty that we think are of value for thinking about what it means to work towards a model of Indigenous data sovereignty within archaeology. And you'll see these 4 points here. One, that it's process-based, the issue grappling with the issue of data dependency, of indigenizing data, and the final element of collaborative thinking. So this first point here, that Indigenous data sovereignty is a journey, not a destination. It's really similar to our discussions of what an Indigenous archaeology is. Everybody says it's not about the outcomes, it's about the process. It's about the relations and the relations that you create on the journey that you take together. Another important aspect of this is that Indigenous data sovereignty is always an aspiration and not an end point in and of itself, and that it's also context dependent. It leads us, like in thinking through this issue, it leads us to this question of what are the common elements of an Indigenous data sovereignty approach? That is, if we recognize that it's a journey, it's not a destination, what elements of our journey or our routes might look similar to one another? Now, the second point that we think is important to look at is the fact that the legacy of colonialism and Indigenous settler relations has created what Carroll et al. Refer to as data dependency. That is, federal policies of assimilation, forced removal, relocation, residential schooling, and other cultural ruptures that sought to erase Indigenous knowledge and force many tribes to rely on Indigenous sources, external sources of information about their community's economic, environmental, and health status. So this is one element of data dependency. And how we see that dependency working is it's sustained through, as they say, a paradox of scarcity and abundance. Extensive data are collected about Indigenous peoples and nations, but rarely by or for Indigenous peoples and nations purposes. Many of these data do not recognize or privilege Indigenous worldviews or benefit Indigenous peoples themselves. And as a result, Indigenous data ecosystems are characterized by inconsistent, inaccurate, or irrelevant data for Indigenous peoples, external control and ownership, community mistrust, lack of external support for data infrastructure, and data that describe Indigenous peoples and lifeways specifically are always thought through this deficit lens of Indigenous communities as being less than their Western European counterparts. Now, a core element here of achieving Indigenous data sovereignty is challenging this data dependency. And with archaeology, we can see these data dependencies very clearly. Rarely are Indigenous communities in control of setting the terms of how their knowledge and or heritage is collected. More importantly, rarely do they get to set the terms of how we recognize their data as data, how we collect it, how we manage it, how we share it. And more recently, with discussions of big data and data science and working in an open way in archaeology, rarely is this issue of data dependency addressed, despite the fact that many of the large data sets that archaeology data scientists are working with and are manipulating are directly related to Indigenous communities across the globe. And we think this is a really important point for us to consider as archaeologists interested in this, and thinking about what tools we can use to challenge this data dependency within archaeology and heritage management, to change the ways in which we're working with Indigenous heritage and knowledge. The third point that we've highlighted here is that Indigenous data sovereignty includes integration of Indigenous values, which ground the governance of all data. Within this, we see the data as being fully under control of the nation, and that the nation itself is using their own vision and their own definitions to determine how their information, how their knowledge will be curated and cared for in appropriate ways. And Keisha really captured this beautifully last week in her discussion of Métis archaeology and her demonstration of the unique and interwoven strands of a specifically Métis analytic framework, which she was discussing really got to the heart of how we can begin to integrate Indigenous values at a ground level that then structure all of our interactions with Indigenous data. And here there's a related question here, and there's a related question here for us specifically, as you know, neither Ian nor Briece or I are actually enrolled tribal members of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and it begs the question, what does it mean for us as outsiders to develop and implement Indigenous data, an approach to Indigenous data sovereignty as these outsiders? And as such, what responsibilities or obligations are inherent to this positionality, and how might these differ from those observed by community members who are doing this work themselves? Now, finally, the final element of this is about the need for collective data standards. Right now, Indigenous data sovereignty is a conceptual tool that has been really active within the last 5 years. There's only now beginning to emerge some kind of overarching data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty principles. But there's still more work here that needs to be done to create local, regional, and transnational data standards, as well as sharing of governance strategies that Indigenous peoples across the globe have developed. Related question here that we've been thinking about in our work with Grand Ronde is, how are the tools that we use to recover and manage Indigenous data shaped by our relationships with Indigenous knowledge and oversight? Now, as co-creators of Field Methods in Indigenous Archaeology, a community-based field school and research project that Briece, Ian, and myself direct, as well as the Deputy Tribal Historic Preservation Officer at Briece's, we'd like to share what we've learned in creating a Grand Ronde way of doing archaeology, and of creating a sovereignty-based approach to that archaeological practice, and specifically to how we come to know and work with Grand Ronde data. Now, discussions of data in archaeology can often focus on the final stages of data governance, that is storage and access and dissemination. While these issues are really important and speak to direct control over heritage data, and also to a bringing home of knowledge that has historically been severed from Indigenous communities, our goal today is to focus on the ethics and politics of how data become data. This focus situates the specific tools of Indigenous data governance within a larger framework of what it means to work towards decolonizing data and supporting the sovereignty of Indigenous nations. Now, in sharing our examples from the Historic Preservation Office's internal work, as well as the lessons that we've taken away from Field Methods in Indigenous Archaeology, we hope that we're going to be able to offer you guys, the audience, additional sources of inspiration for for thinking through these 4 questions that we've posed about what the elements of Indigenous data sovereignty can look like, what tools we can use and do use to challenge data dependency, what does it mean to develop and implement Indigenous data tools as outsiders, and finally, what this relationship is between the tools themselves and the Indigenous knowledge frameworks that govern them. Now, in terms of structure, I'm going to turn it over to Briece so that he can share the approach that the Grand Ronde Historic Preservation Office and Culture Department uses to identify, collect, and share tribal data and knowledge with one another. And after that, I'll return and talk a little bit more about the overarching Field Methods and Indigenous Archaeology project that we've created. And Ian will wrap things up by talking about some of the outcomes, the data outcomes of the approach that we've developed with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. So at this point, I'd like to invite Briece to share examples from his work within the Historic Preservation Office. And Briece, you can just tell me when to advance the slides. They should be in the same order.
Great. I have mine all queued up here if necessary. Let me take first a moment to say thank you very much for this opportunity and for how much interest is being expressed by the participants here this afternoon. I know that it's late on a Friday afternoon, and that shows caring. So hands raised. Thank you. Grand Ronde looks at the data through multiple lenses. The first is, concept and function. There's a driver behind this once we start calling it data. Before we get to that, we understand it that it just simply is. And so as we operationalize, for clarification, Tribal Historic Preservation Office is a branch of the tribal government. So with that, we bring our own bureaucracies. We are also responsible for enacting the will, the direction of the tribe. So a lot of those concerns as a quote outsider operating are already laid out. We look at through cultural resource concerns, how do we conceptualize this information? How do we, once conceptualized, we bring it into a world of data, and then we're continually through our office looking at what are the ongoing uses and functions. These are part of our responsibilities in an office. Data tends to suddenly lose personality. It loses life in a traditional sense. And our office in particular is dedicated to the continuation, the reacquainting of community with information. So next slide, Sarah. So we look at we've taken the work that we do. Much of what we do is place-based, whether it's a governmental review or a government agency to agency relationship of project review or correspondence or recording places on the landscape, or where the economy, the time of the story people, animal people, where that takes place. And we provide interpretation. We then are obligated to look at the variety of information, how diverse that type of information is, and what's the vehicle in which we can capture and manipulate and see multiple functions of that going forward. All of this, next slide, gets to sovereignty. Each of these is a step or demonstration of the tribe's sovereignty, taking the control of the information, the selection of that information, and determination of how to understand it. We're charged with some very sensitive information, within the tribe some of the most sensitive information. And how do we capture and do right culturally by that information? If you take a concept of an oral tradition where to write something down may actually be inappropriate, how do we capture that essence while respecting the intent? And that leads us to choice of vocabulary. How do we capture this? Oftentimes we will seek to use the indigenous language, the nuance that resides in that vocabulary is actually what's necessary for that continuation. Again, we're seeing demonstration of sovereignty, self-governance, and accessibility. So moving to the next in my list here, we have the application of the tool. In our world, in my office, we live in GIS. There's a reason behind that. First is, it's now the new language. Whether it's English or Chinook or Santillon. GIS is what I need to use to level the playing field when I'm speaking to an agency. And again, you're seeing demonstration of self-governance. And by operating in that language and being well versed in it, I can now start the conversation. I can help others translate and seek understanding through this now shared vocabulary. We can see how that information is archived for the tribe, but also for agencies. We can ensure that there's a reacquainting and that we're operating in a format that is available in a way that we're not ready for yet. The same way that oral tradition wasn't ready for written word, but now we are. So, and more importantly, and I saw this on almost every one of the typed chat, is who controls the narrative, for lack of a better term. We're operating with the translation of information, and we've worked with government agencies, and the short answer is once we go into a digital format, we have to be prepared to relinquish or accept that it will be discoverable. So that leads us to do two things. Next, Sarah. Is we find ways of sharing that information that obscure the detail. We operate at scales that meet the need, so that the importance for another government agency is that there's confidence in what we are saying, the same way that we have to have confidence in what an agency is saying. So I apologize for being very narrowed in the bureaucratic world. But moving on, we use information when we're talking with agencies that is already publicly available. We mine libraries, we mine maps, we mine written ethnographic records, because it's discoverable. There's a value in that. Once I know it's discoverable, I can direct somebody else to make it also discoverable. In doing that, I'm bringing life back to that 1880 story. That makes it real. That brings it back to today. So that may be reference to place names or exact locations of village sites. But we also get into where gathering areas are, where we can share that, or we can gather internally and make it available inwardly. So one of the ways that we do that is Collector app. It's an ESRI product. There are pluses and minuses, I'll fully admit that. We chose to use it for several reasons. One, is it will load on a cell phone quite easily. And in doing that, we had a inadvertent discovery in that elders may not be well acquainted with doing more than calling, but youngsters know how to work these things. So we're now bridging a generational gap in a sharing of knowledge just through this medium alone. Out of this, we're able to present information out, but we're also able to see information input that stays proprietary. So a family's gathering area for basket material, I would like to know because I can protect it from a road going through, whereas they may not want their neighbors knowing. So here's a way of providing gates to some of that information for the different functions, purposes. It allows for crowdsourcing of information. We will put in notices in the newspaper about hunting areas so that, when we're doing a study of hunting and what is being taken with our natural resources department, it is all fed back into the system. So next slide, please. So this is what it looks like. It's very easy. These are just examples. Next. Another example of data, we worked with Bureau of Ocean Energy Management several years ago in developing a tribal cultural landscape. So one of the things that we are often encountering is scale. Rather than an archaeological site being measured in 20 meters 15 by 15 meters, it's the landscape, because for Grand Ronde, the interconnectivity of location is how one experiences, it's how one knows, and it's how one executes stewardship. And through that process, you have the responsibility for investing that knowledge into the next generation. So go ahead. You'll see here this information, we stacked it together. It meant that we got very creative in how one understands data processing. The result, however, is taking specific loci and then translating it for the purposes of the contract, which was not to know where everything was. It was to develop a tool so that a conversation that needed to happen was ensured to happen. So what you're seeing here in these images is not the sensitivity to where sites are. What you're seeing is how many sites can be seen from there. Because of the importance of viewshed, that became our translation point for processing, but also ensuring that a conversation can be had. For what it's worth, those red areas are the highest run there is, I believe it's 3,000 places of importance can be seen from those red rasters, and the darkest green, you're still seeing 50 minimum places of concern. So the importance here is not to say red light is stop, green light is go. Everything is stop and have a conversation. Again, sovereignty and who handles the translation and the interpretation. Go ahead, next. And we use the software also for tracking and almost as an archive. For us, every regulatory action that we review, and on average it's about 7,000 a year, we input. And as a way of ensuring that we're tracking where projects occur and what the damages are, but we're able to use that now as an archive for what we said our concerns were. Because through a regulatory place or position, we will see that projects go dormant They may go dormant for 5, 10, 15 years. I'm working on one that just, you know, we call them zombie projects, has come back to life and we're engaging with. Others will have a longevity of another project, 15 years for the project alone. So we've had a level of staff turnover, and it's important through that sovereignty, we are the ones in know. And it becomes then empowering when others can come to us and ask for, hey, we're missing this in our files. So it's a demonstration of empowerment, but also authority. So taking that step further, if you will. Go ahead, and I promise to be done in a minute. There we go.
Sorry, I didn't include the other two. I thought they were the same.
No. Yes.
I'll go back to the other one. You can still talk a little bit, Briece.
Oh, you're hearing a consistent theme from me, and that is, you know, why this is a framework. There's empowerment. Grand Ron is generously invest in its staff, both in training and the hardware and software, but also the empowerment. And I think that's a critical element in all of this, is that they're, through a bureaucrat lens, is where that empowerment resides. And for use, collection, interpretation, and then dissemination. So in that, you know, you've heard that there's the sovereignty, but my staff has a very deep understanding of GIS. And quite frankly, we spend a lot of time getting a little crazy with it because it doesn't need to stay rigid. We can get creative with this as a format until another one comes along. And that's one of the things, back to the earlier slide, being prepared for the next. We're currently working on a project where we are taking the econym, the oral histories, both historic as well as near future, and coupling that with current land cover, historic land cover, and able to make cross references by keyword search. So you can go out, and if you're in, say, beaver habitat, where there's a beaver dam, you can go to that, click on it. The list of the stories that reference beaver come up. But now what that's also doing is reinforcing a traditional way of understanding, is that those stories are always in one's mind when you're on the landscape. When you encounter a beaver's dam, you're automatically associating the story of beaver as he set the flood in place. Or if you're in a riparian cover, you know, tree cover, and you're encountering things like vine maple. Well, vine maple is this kind of indicator that you're now in a whole suite of stories that talk about stewardship and how to care for that. So all of this is the internal purpose. We're using it also to then translate for stewardship responsibilities of the Forest Service and restoration now that we've had such fire damage. It will inform the restoration. There's an economic element in that we can help identify the species that are actually want to be there, that are not invasives, and actually are going to be more hardy and withstand future fire damage. I think with that, otherwise we're going to go on for an hour, and I know that Ian has a lot to say as well. So again, thank you all for this opportunity. Andrew, Sarah, I greatly appreciate this.
Well, we're really happy that this is actually on Zoom, because last time around, Briece and other members of the Historic Preservation Office weren't going to be able to join us. They're like, we can't talk for them about all of the fabulous work. And actually, this is the first time I've been able to hear about this new project. I'm really really excited to see more of it, hopefully next summer here. So I want to transition a little bit to thinking about how we as outsiders, Ian and I, have worked with Briece and members of the Historic Preservation Office to create Field Methods in Indigenous Archaeology, which is a community-based partnership that we developed in 2014, very shortly after I came to the University of Washington. And I think Ian was in his second year of grad school. Briece Edwards, and at the time Eric Thorsgaard, was the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and David Harrelson, who's now the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. They invited us down to talk about whether or not we would be interested in partnering with them on a project designed to enhance and build their capacity to care for and protect tribal historic properties on the reservation in northwestern Oregon. And since that time, we have worked with them to create both a field school as well as a series of projects that assist, that are capacity building in nature. That is, they enhance the Historic Preservation Office ability to care for and protect those ancestral sites on the reservation. A key element of this is establishing a way for doing archaeology on the reservation that is sovereignty based. That is, that it works for and in accordance with Grand Ron's tribal cultural protocols and methodologies for how to come to know and work with and engage with ancestral places and belongings. This is a really important element, and it's also one that the HPO didn't and still doesn't really have the full capacity to do, because a lot of their work, as Briece, all the projects that Briece is describing are, or at least many of them, are related to development projects happening within the ancestral homelands. It means that the resources are going by and large to those that are being heavily impacted, for example, in Eugene, in Salem, in Portland, as well as other areas. It's a large area to be responsible for and to have managed, or to have oversight and consultative authority over. So our work through Field Methods in Indigenous Archaeology, or FMIA, is really directed to the reservation itself and to thinking about how we can create internal processes for how the Historic Preservation Office can approach having to do mitigation work or archaeological recovery work on lands that they directly own and have sovereignty over. Now, major goal here in developing this project is to shift how archaeology tells Grand Ron's history and heritage, so that our history-telling methodologies, that is how we begin to construct these histories and stories and tell them both within community and outside community, how we can change them to support the sovereignty of the tribe. The work that we've begun here is part of a larger project of unsettling terminal narratives of settler colonialism that presuppose the assimilation, dissolution, displacement, erasure, and abstraction of Indigenous peoples from their homelands. And in this case, what we're trying to do is use archaeology as a tool of resistance, as one that is helping to go from, abstraction to specific definitions of what it means to live and be in community at Grand Ron, both in the past, as today, and into the future. We're thus working together to replace Grand Ron into the present by tracing its continued survivance, from the formation of the tribal reservation and creation of the Confederated Nation in the mid-1850s, throughout the 19th and 20th century, where colonial policies were designed to extinguish the sovereignty of the nation and indeed terminated the tribe, into the restoration of the tribe in the late 1980s, and into our contemporary moment and future. But part of this work is creating an Indigenous archaeology, what George Nicholas has defined as an archaeology by, with, and for Indigenous peoples and nations. There's three kind of core elements we see as three core elements of this approach to practice. And it looks really similar to the Indigenous data sovereignty approach. So there's a recognition of fundamental recognition of tribal sovereignty to determine the nature and scope of research on and about their peoples. It's an approach that is grounded in Indigenous knowledge and cultural protocols. And in our case, it's grounded in Grand Ronde ways of knowing and doing archaeology that works, like I said, for and in accordance with those protocols. And the final element of this is the creation of an equitable participatory research practice. The centerpiece of this equitable practice for us has been implementing a community-based research protocol that outlines not only the work, the research questions, the methods that we're using, but also the responsibilities of us as archaeologists to the tribal community, as well as our responsibilities to the ancestral places and belongings that we're working with. The community-based research protocol that we've developed, it also outlines tribal decision-making authority over all aspects of our project. And this is really the primary mechanism for integrating Grand Ronde needs, goals, and methodologies into the research process itself. And like I said, it's also important because it outlines what responsibilities we as researchers have to community. And very rarely do researchers really think through ourselves in relation to other individuals and places. In outlining those responsibilities, we begin to move away from an extractive approach to research that's characterized archaeology for the majority of its history to one where we are creating knowledge with community. Knowledge that's embedded in our relationality, in Indigenous methodology, in respect, in trust, in economy. These are the things that frame our ability to work together and to begin to broach the divide between archaeologists and Indigenous nations. It's also a key means of challenging data dependency in archaeology, like I said, which is historically been an extractive science, and it's a way for us to move control from decision making from us as archaeologists to the tribe directly. The result of this community-based participatory research protocol is our low-impact archaeological methodology. And this methodology is what governs on the ground how we come to know ancestral places and begin to work with ancestral belongings. And this methodology itself is premised on maximizing the information that we can recover while minimizing physical and spiritual disturbances to these places, and most importantly, to the people connected to them. And this is something that that Briece, Ian, and I discuss in detail in that 2018 article that Andrew mentioned at the outset, and we're happy to talk about later. What's important for today is it's not so much the focus on the methods and tools, because these methods and tools are just being used in pursuit of this larger goal of recognizing and embedding tribal sovereignty into everything that we do, to how we recognize Indigenous data as such and then work with it. And in this case, the important element here is minimizing harm in community. And we minimize that harm in community by integrating Grand Ronde values. That is, and those values specifically around a relationality to both, community, human and non-human, to the places and to the belongings that we are working with. And we try to implement this not just in the tools that we use within the field and lab, but also in our daily practices. Because in order to do a Grand Ronde archaeology appropriately, the responsibilities carry through into our own personal practices. Now, I want to turn it over now to Ian to share, so that he can share a little bit more in detail how this overarching methodology and our community-based research protocol has worked in practice. And he's going to share with you guys some examples from the archaeological as well as archival analysis that he's conducted, both with field methods in Indigenous archaeology, as well as a consultant with the Historic Preservation Office.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So, the main point that I want to make in my section here is to really highlight how FMIA is enhancing the work that the tribe and the Historic Preservation Office specifically is already doing. So all those projects that Briece mentioned, the work that we are trying to do really is not about necessarily developing any particular digital tool or platform, but using the tools at our disposal and to think through how resolving data dependency and encouraging Indigenous data sovereignty can help us tell new stories, and what are the implications for when we begin from a collaborative place. How does that alter then other elements of the research process downstream? And so in talking about some of the results of some of our projects today, that's really the point that I want to emphasize, is that these are sort of the practices that we see of realizing data sovereignty, and then these are some of the results that come with that, and these results would not have been possible had we not begun from this place of collaboration, and of capacity building, and supporting Grand Ronde sovereignty. So next slide, Sarah, thanks. So much of my work with Briece and the Historic Preservation Office has focused on the Grand Ronde Land Tenure Project. So this was a project originally started in 2014 by Historic Preservation staff, explicitly as an effort to identify spatial data, primarily maps and land records, concerning the history of the Grand Ronde Reservation, but held by outside institutions. So really addressing this idea of data dependency at the outset, to import some of that material back to Grand Ronde, digitize key elements within GIS and other database platforms, and then integrate this information with existing databases held by the tribe, as well as other lines of evidence, oral histories, community knowledge, all in an effort to help the Historic Preservation Office's goal in protecting heritage and archaeological sites and in their consulting efforts, as well as to create new research opportunities for tribal staff and tribal members, inform land purchasing decisions, etc. And all of these desired outcomes not only came with resolving data dependency, but was about engaging with data on terms that were set by the Grand Ronde Historic Preservation Office. So the HPO, again, relating back to some of those capacity-related challenges that Sarah mentioned, since they're in the process of reviewing 7,000 projects a year, they tasked me with doing some of that archival work. So I traveled to several different regional and national repositories that held information about Grand Ronde Reservation, the Grand Ronde Reservation and surrounding townships in Western Oregon. Identified historical maps, which included everything from allotment surveys to timber assessments, imported that into a GIS environment and digitized available attributes regarding land use, parcel ownership, settlement locations, vegetation patterns, those sorts of things. And then this database was then merged with those already maintained by the Historic Preservation Office for them to use during cultural resource reviews, as I mentioned. And it also supported new analysis into reservation land tenure and served as a foundation for archaeological research within field methods in Indigenous archaeology, which I'll get to in just a couple minutes. So next slide. And a parallel project that was going on at the same time as the land tenure project was identifying references in documents created by reservation agents and other federal officials regarding particular Grand Ronde lifeways, including the acquisition of traditional foods, house construction and organization, and settlement location. HPO staff knew that community lifeways were far different from the narratives presented by reservation agents to their overseers in Washington, D.C. Namely, that Grand Ronde was fast shedding all traditional practices and lifeways and identities and assimilating into society. But in order to circumvent some of these the biases inherent to agents' writings, and in the process begin to understand better understand the on-the-ground realities of reservation life, particularly during the 19th and early 20th century, I worked with HPO staff to take these references and extract them from that sort of colonial archive and begin to read them against other sources of information. So next slide, Sarah. And so we did that we read those information against community histories, particularly, and some of those have been published. For instance, the very invaluable reflections of Louis Conoyer, who lived at Grand Ronde during the 19th and early 20th century, as well as compare them to the insights that Sara and I had learned through FMIA by contemporary Grand Ronde tribal members and staff. And in doing this process allowed us to go beyond those very colonial observations about Grand Ronde life and begin to formulate a series of expectations, particularly archaeological expectations, about the roles traditional foods, house construction, and travel off-reservation, the roles that those practices might have played in Grand Ronde daily life, how those might have compared to pre-reservation periods, and how residents at Grand Ronde might have viewed or seen those practices in a new light, given the histories that they had experienced of dispossession and removal to the reservation. And to return to the question Sara posed earlier, this process, the land tenure process, the land tenure research, as well as looking at these archival references, was an example of using relatively simple digital tools, but in ways that would not have been possible without an in-place commitment to supporting Grand Ronde knowledge. Collaboration informed how we used digital tools rather than the other way around. So next slide, Sara. So to get to just briefly some of the results of the land tenure project, by bringing this data home to Grand Ronde, it allowed us to document in a new way how the federal government continued to expand its control over Grand Ronde land, particularly in the decades following the implementation of the Dawes Act of 1887. Grand Ronde was among the first group of reservations in the United States to be subjected to the policy which divided tribal land into individually owned plots. Identified land records and reports showed how land owned in trust, which was in some ways shielded from market forces that were intent on transferring native land to settlers, how that trust land steadily declined during the first half of the 20th century. So much so that by the 1950s, less than 1% of the 61,000 acre reservation was held in trust. And nearly all of the non-trust land, as far as we can tell, passed out of Grand Ronde ownership during this period as well. So HPO staff knew before the start of the land tenure project that allotment had had disastrous impacts on reservation land ownership, but they were unsure of how this process unfolded again across time and space. And by bringing some of these data home and contextualizing them with other sources of community-held knowledge, we were able to document this important history, this difficult but important history of dispossession at Grand Ronde. And in other ways, it showed us, the project also revealed the steps the community took in the face of dispossession and other government assimilation policies, the steps that they took to preserve long important connections between different groups on the reservation. So the map on the left was made in the 1850s, shortly after the reservation's establishment. And it shows the distribution of different Western Oregon Native peoples as they lived on the reservation in the 1850s. Interestingly, the relative location of early reservation settlement, the relative location of early reservation settlements mirrors their distribution in the pre-reservation cultural landscape of Oregon. So communities from the Willamette Valley in northwestern Oregon tended to live in the northern part of the reservation here. Those from the Umpqua and Rogue River valleys in southwestern Oregon lived in the southern part of the reservation, and those from the foothills of the Cascades and the eastern part of western Oregon lived on the eastern part of the reservation. And so that's a pretty, there's a lot to say about that result and what that meant for reestablishing the Grand Ronde as sort of a native place, despite dispossession and removal. But one of the most interesting things that we found as we compared this then to other land records that we had identified was that this was not a temporary phenomenon. Despite all the writings over the next subsequent decades of reservation agents saying that the community was building, the community's settlements were virtually indistinguishable from those of settlers, we learned that this practice of living with extended families and living near historical neighbors really was reproduced through the allotment period. So next slide, Sara. So we saw that in the allotment period through different forms of data. One of them was that we were able to digitize allotment records and show that people into the 1880s were securing parcels near their extended family members and near those with historical ties to particular places or who may have spoken the same particular language. And so reproducing that cultural landscape again and again through time. But we also saw it on a finer scale on individual properties. So as one example of that, here on the left is a small 7-acre property that's currently part of the tribe's powwow grounds on the eastern, near the eastern edge of the reservation. And it was allotted to tribal member James Foster as part of his larger allotment. And Foster, a close friend of Foster's was Edward Tebow, pictured here, and he did not receive an allotment because he was fishing on the Columbia River when the allotting agent was at Grand Run. Foster advocated on Tebow's behalf to the agents that he should receive an allotment, but they were told that none would be awarded. And it seems that in order to address this problem, Foster sold this 7-acre parcel to Edward's brother, Joseph. We don't know specifically why, he may have sold it, but it seems to us, given these other lines of information, that people at Grand Ronde intimately understood that private property ownership, despite being presented as this, assimilationist policy, was very much a way that they could manipulate, the settler colonial systems into preserving relationships between families and preserve connections to Grand Ronde. And when we learned this about this place and through additional discussions with HPO staff, they identified that this place would be a good one to conduct archaeological investigation and to look for additional ways in which the community kind of maintain connection through material belongings at this particular place. And given that this is part of the powwow grounds, already a very significant place for Grand Ronde, this work took on even more importance. So, next slide, Sara. And so over several field seasons, we, using the low impact methodology that Sara mentioned, we identified household related deposits on this parcel that spoke to different periods and different types of connection that those at Grand Ronde had maintained through time. So everything from 19th century glass beads that were probably imported during the early years of the reservation, obsidian and other lithic belongings that were, show the continued lithic production on the reservation, to flaked glass and other creative uses of mass-produced items from settler factories. And this story of connection between different places where lithic raw material was gathered and different practices that were carried out in the gathering of plants and traditional plant and animal foods, we see that story of connection carried through into today. So during our work, we also identified items like this plastic friendship bracelet and other plastic beads that might have been part of powwow regalia or were created by families during powwows and other ceremonies. And so for us, it was a really poignant reminder as outsiders that these types of what we recognize as data really is determined by the context that we're putting around it in the research process. And by participating and learning from Grand Ronde in a very intimate and continual way, and doing this work on the powwow grounds where these celebrations are taking place, we can see evidence like this friendship bracelet of this enduring connection in which the tribe is really laying the groundwork for a self-determined present and future. Last slide here. Yeah, so to conclude, during powwows and ceremonies at the Chichalu Plank House, which is also on those powwow grounds, Grand Ronde language and cultural specialist Bobby Mercier often remarks that children growing up at Grand Ronde today will not know a time when the powwow arbor, seen here on the left, and the Chichalu Plank House did not exist. And this is a powerful statement of Grand Ronde survivance and the community's efforts to create a self-determined future that addresses the historical legacies and contemporary realities of U.S. settler colonialism in Western Oregon. And as Sara and I have learned in working with Grand Ronde tribal members and staff, the work of supporting Grand Ronde sovereignty remains foundational to the work of tribal members and staff. Many acutely remember the 3 decades between the 1950s and 1980s in which the tribe did not hold federal recognition due to assimilationist termination policies. Grand Ronde's restoration in an event commemorated with annual celebrations and the Visionaries Memorial, seen here on the right, highlight that the enduring Grand Ronde presence in the history, present, and future of Western Oregon. And our contributions as part of FMIA and the Land Tenure Project are very small compared to the project of restoration and the tribe's continued efforts to protect and strengthen connections to important places on and off the historical reservation. Yet it is our hope that by beginning from a place of collaboration and guided by Grand Ronde knowledge and goals, the archaeology that we conduct will support the capacity of the nation to assert its sovereignty over tribal heritage in whatever form that might take. So Hayamasi, thank you to all of you for being here and for participating. And I think we would probably love to hear from more of you about this.